Hey everyone, welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Patrick McCabe's new novel, Poguemahone, which was published just a few months ago in 2022 by Unbound Publishing. Unbound is a crowdfunding publisher, but Patrick McCabe is a very well-established Irish author who has, I believe, twice been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. What drew me to Poguemahone is that it is ostensibly a 600-page novel in verse. And I say ostensibly because it is written in a very free verse, where the structure of it is very experimental and it fluctuates quite a bit. And it seems to me to be drawing much more heavily from oral traditions, oral storytelling than anything else. Poguemahone has also been compared to some, very great books. I mean, on the back of this book, there's a quote by Alex Preston from The Observer who writes, "If you're looking for this century's Ulysses, look no further. A stunningly lyrical novel." Is Poguemahone this century's Ulysses? No, it's not trying to be. Is it a stunningly lyrical novel? Yes, absolutely. It's very lyrical. This is a novel that I think is best listened to or read out loud. I cannot recommend enough that you listen to Patrick McCabe's performance of this while reading along, as McCabe's performance really makes this poem come to life. This is all to say that I don't think we need to compare Poguemahone to Ulysses. I mean, the only real comparison that I can see is that both authors were Irish, or are Irish men, and they are both interested in wordplay and folklore. But outside of that, there's really no other direct comparison to be made between these two works. But anyways, let's talk about Poguemahone, whose title itself really sets the tone. Poguemahone, as the epigraph to this book explains, is an anglicized form of a Gaelic phrase, which translates to "kiss my arse." To whom this title is directed, I'm not entirely sure, but it does really set the tone for what you'll find inside: an impish, tongue-in-cheek, but punk and anti-authority aesthetic reminiscent of the Beat Poets, as well as a mixing of Irish culture and language with English. This novel is narrated by a man named Dan Fogarty, who is dealing with his sister, Una, who is really struggling. She has developed Alzheimer's, and so of course she's losing her memory. But they are a very close brother and sister pair. They moved to London, to Kilburn, London, which is an area just outside of London that is very dominated by Irish immigrants. And they moved there together with their mother, I believe in the 1960s, and they are very much of the working class. And in the past, when they first moved there, this novel moves back and forth between their kind of youth living in London and the present, where Una is about 70 years old and living in the assisted living facility. In their youth, they hung out with a bunch of sort of hippie types. And so this book is very much interested in that kind of hippie drug culture and all the popular culture, especially music, that surrounds that subculture. Again, this book seems very much inspired by the Beat Poets. But in the present, Dan and Una's relationship is increasingly fraught, as, again, Dan is trying to learn how to live with his sister, or live with the knowledge that his sister is losing her memory. And so, as I'm sure you can tell, there is a strong focus in this novel on memory, as our two main characters are Irish immigrants. They're Irish exiles who are living in London, and they're trying to retain their Irish identity. Una is literally losing her memory, so in a way she's sort of losing her Irish identity. While this book is very much about these larger questions of cultural identity and cultural memory, I mean, what does it mean to be Irish? What does it mean to be an Irish immigrant? And thus this book is very much in conversation with other contemporary Irish authors. I mean, just to name a couple that I really like, Eavan Boland and Eimear McBride. But what Poguemahone does that's so interesting is fuse this with a devastating look at Alzheimer's and how that affects personal memory. And so in a way, this book is very much just about Alzheimer's and the failure of memory. What does it mean when people lose their larger cultural memory, but their personal memory as well? I'll come back to that in just a second. But Poguemahone opens with this scene of Dan and Una standing on a bridge and throwing things over the side. And I'll just read it so you can get a taste for the narrative form of this book. "Oi, get over here, you," she says the other day. "Yes, get the frig on over. Do you hear? Is it true that only just this morning you were up in London?" "Yes, it is," I say. "What of it anyways?" And she turns and lets out an outlandish yelp, making a swipe at a crock of flowers, causing a near riot in the lobby, as staff from all angles come running, out of breath. "Are you trying to ruin our reputation?" one of them says. with a bit of a nervous laugh. But for all our disagreements, I didn't ever think we'd end up where we did. That is to say, beyond the Limehouse Basin, tossing canvas bags over the parapet of a bridge, shivering there together in the cold East London dawn, with the pair of us, awestruck, petrified beneath the red sky spanning Jerusalem, watching leopards with the wings of eagles gliding into land over a body of water already on fire. I mean, you wouldn't, would you? But somehow, that's how it always tends to be with our Una. That's how it always seems to end up. And this is a scene that echoes again and again and again throughout this novel. And what they're throwing over the bridge in the canvas bags, that's for you to figure out. But throughout this novel, there are just so many images of things, people, ideas, cultures, memories falling and crashing down. We get these constant references to the V-1 bombers of World War II, the Vergeltungswaffe, or vengeful weapon. The name is very important, which strike again and again throughout this novel, seemingly at random, but each time it hits, it destroys everything. And of course, historically, the V-1 bombers were used on London during the Blitz, so there is this historical layer. But what's interesting is McCabe uses these V-1 bombers and these images of things falling and crashing down to explore mental health crises. Mr. Bayan sadly died in 1964. Una says she was glad to see the back of him because all he ever was a no-good Bowsy and braggart. Yes, to hell with the selfish, ignorant, good-for-nothing, she says. And then starts crying and picking fights with everyone around her. But that's only when she's feeling upset and experiencing yet another bout of the dreaded, what we call the imni, which be another word for anxiety or depression in Gaelic, describing what it's like when the V1s have appeared, hanging there in silence, glacially frozen in the air, just above your head, getting ready to come right down, going V, before, what do you know, another whole street or a factory has gone. Poof. As I gestured at, the idea of exploring Irish identity through the eyes of Irish immigrants is a very well-trodden path. Looking at the Irish diaspora, especially the diaspora from Ireland to London, is something that so many writers have written about. I mean, my favorite that I've read in recent years is The Lesser Bohemians by Eimear McBride, which is just brilliant. But Poguemahone isn't just a simple or a straightforward immigration novel by any means, as this novel is rife with the supernatural, and it explores how, through the use of folklore and the supernatural, how Irish culture and Irish identity literally haunt our characters. One way this happens is with that imni, which the quote I just read referenced, which is, in English, what we might describe very generally as anxiety or depression, or, again, very, very generally, perhaps too generally, as mental health issues. But what's interesting is how these mental health issues are described in Poguemahone not only as these V1 bombers just coming out of nowhere and dropping bombs on these individuals, but there is this supernatural element as well. See, Poguemahone is very interested in Irish folklore, and the most prominent aspect of that folklore that it's interested in is this creature called the Gruagach. And this is a creature that is similar in some ways to like a goblin or a wild man, perhaps kind of akin to fairies, though, again, there are all these different traditions, even within Ireland, that have different aspects of the Gruagach. But in Poguemahone, the Gruagach is this creature that, quote, hasn't been born right. And he haunts all of these various people. And when he shows up, well, something usually bad will happen to that character soon after. They're often struck by that imni, and that leads them down this very bad path that often ends in self-harm in some way. But the thing is that this is just folklore. That is, few people actually believe in the Gruagach. So when people say they claim that they saw it, very few people around them believe in it. And so they just assume that this person has been struck by some sort of mental illness and that they just need to get over it. And so there is this layering of causation throughout Poguemahone, where folklore is used to describe and understand things that we, even in the 21st century, don't really understand. Things like depression, anxiety, suicide, dementia. We think we understand these things, but I mean, we really don't. There was this research paper that came out just a couple of weeks ago, actually, that called into question any sort of causative relationship between serotonin levels in the brain and depression. Now, I'm not saying this isn't the case, obviously. I'm not a scientist at all. But what McCabe does that I find so interesting is use folklore to explain these things that even we in our post-Enlightenment rationality, even we have trouble explaining. McCabe is interested in that which we don't understand. Alzheimer's, dementia, depression, suicide, etc. As well as things like memory, which again, we don't really understand that well. Why do we remember some things but not others? Why do some things stick and others fade away? How much control do we have over these memories? How real are these memories versus how fictionalized are they in our minds? And this brings me to Dan, our narrator. And this is something that isn't really clear from the start. This is something that I began to think about probably 150 pages into this novel, and then it took me about another 100 pages for me to really start believing it. So I'll have timestamps down below. Feel free to skip ahead if you don't want this spoiled for you, but I will say that I think coming to realize this or coming to think about this about a third the way through this novel or so really makes this book much more interesting. So feel free to skip ahead or don't. What I want to talk about is how Dan is in many ways a very unreliable narrator. He is Una's brother, and he hints quite a few times that he has this incestuous relationship, or at the very least is very in love with Una. And so much of this book is about Una. It's about her experiences, her memories, her feelings. We get all of these flashback scenes of her when they are young and living in London, where she was dealing with fat phobia. All these characters call her Fudge Fogarty. She's dealing with this abusive relationship with this Scotsman named Troy McClory, etc. That is, Una feels real. She feels like an individual with history. And Dan, well, we never really get any stories about Dan. He's always just kind of there on the sideline, or he's just kind of witnessing these stories sort of disembodied. He's never at the center of these stories. And so you begin to question if Dan even exists. As I suggested, evidence of this begins appearing a couple hundred pages into this novel as Una begins worrying that her friends won't even believe that Dan is real, just like those who saw the Gruagach fear that their friends won't believe that they actually saw the Gruagach. That's the thing that she fears most of all, and that Rutherford or someone will make her check out, saying there isn't any such thing as Dan Fogarty, or anyone else, because it's just you, madame. Yes, it's just you, Una Fogarty. You and your battered and bruised subconscious. That's what she fears most of all, because alone in this world, she knows it's not the truth. And that maybe I'll decide to appear someday just to show them how real I am. Hey, just how fucking real we Fogartys can be. Now, I'm not saying that you need to read the novel like this, though, as I'll get to in just a second, the author himself seems to believe that Dan isn't real, though you can take that or leave it as you will. But with this in mind, this really just restructures the entire novel, as what was presented as real, well, isn't real. Or it's only real in Una's Alzheimer's tormented head, which is real, but it doesn't take place in what we might call consensus reality. And of course, this sort of explains all of these supernatural and folkloric elements in this novel. However, I don't think we really need to, or I don't think we really should write all of this off as the irrational creation of a sick woman. Instead, what I think McCabe is doing is offering a different layer or a different view of reality. One that is irrational by modern standards, but no less true. Folklore, magic, myths, these all answer reality's biggest questions, as do science and as do religion. And whichever is more or less true is really up to the individual believer. For McCabe, much of the world is irrational. It isn't explainable through reason or rationality as much as we like to think that it is. Diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia aren't rational. We don't really know what causes Alzheimer's or dementia. We have theories and working hypotheses, and they're based in science, don't get me wrong, but they don't fully explain it. And further, Alzheimer's and dementia are, by nature, irrational. I mean, patients with Alzheimer's one day can't recognize the faces of their children, and other days can. It doesn't make any sense, and that's what's scariest about these diseases. This is all to say that Poguemahone is an age-old story about Irish immigrants moving to London and trying to retain their Irish identity, but it's told in this deliriously fragmentary, illogical, and irrational mode, filled with drug-addled scenes, supernatural encounters, and inexplicable events like suicide and dementia. And all of this really calls into question reality itself, as our character's fundamental grasp of reality begins falling apart and melting away, just as our experiences of that reality does, as we begin to realize that our narrator, our lifeline to this story, might just be a product of Una's imagination. And of course, to take this to its natural conclusion, this is all a product of Patrick McCabe's imagination. And I think what McCabe is interested in, and what he's really exploring, is the very idea of fiction and storytelling. Why write fiction? What is fiction? McCabe seems to have a very similar idea on writing as Jon Fosse, who Jon Fosse views writing as this kind of mystical and irrational and inexplicable creation. When Fosse sits down to write, he has no idea what he's going to write, but then all of a sudden these characters and these scenes and these words begin flowing through him, and he is just a vessel who simply just writes these down on the page. That is, for Fosse, as seems to be the case for McCabe, writing itself is anti-rational. It doesn't quite make sense. But okay, how does this relate to Poguemahone? Well, if this book is about anything, it's about memory. It's about how faulty and fragmentary memory can be, as expressed through Una's Alzheimer's. More specifically, it's about Irish cultural memory and how this memory is preserved through the individual and personal memory of Irish immigrants. Una, in many ways, embodies Irish cultural memory, as she is remembering all of these things, but they're fragmenting and fading away. And so she creates Dan, this link to the past. And who is Dan? Well, as I was kind of doing a bit of research on this book, I came across this great podcast called Across the Pond, where they did an interview with Patrick McCabe, and I highly recommend you check out this specific interview, but that podcast in general as well, where McCabe offers an answer as to who Dan is. McCabe says, "If you're asking me who Dan is, he is the vengeful spirit of the Irish cultural inheritance. There are scores to be settled, and he's settling them in her memory." Now, I rarely care about an author's explanation or interpretation, but I find this to be really interesting. Personal trauma and generational cultural trauma go hand in hand in Poguemahone, as both haunt Una. Like the V-1 bombers that appear again and again throughout this novel, wreaking destruction and threatening apocalypse. Dan, the Gruagach, the one who, quote, wasn't born right, haunts Una and other Irish immigrants in search of vengeance. Poguemahone is as much about colonialism, dispossession, and the Irish diaspora as it is about Irish folklore and the hippie generation. McCabe fuses all of this together in a rompous and psychedelic novel whose free verse experimentation gives him the room to break the fundamental rules of the novel, and so gives him the room to express this in a form that perfectly fits this novel's themes. I'm not too much of a fan of modern poetry, especially free verse poetry. It just rarely clicks for me, though I fully understand that that's a me problem rather than the poem's problem. But Poguemahone really worked for me. And it read often like less of a poem and more of just an oral story with the rhythm of a good oral storyteller. It includes digressions, jokes, references to popular culture and music, and all of these disparate parts really do come together. I'll reiterate one more time. The audio version of this book is wonderful, as McCabe really makes this narrative come to life in all of its varied ways. His performance captures the wide range of topics, modes, and moods of this narrative. This is just another example of the audio version of a book only adding to the experience of reading it. I'm not sure I would have appreciated this book at all if not for the audio version. Like my favorite books, Poguemahone is at its core about very serious topics, but it often doesn't feel serious. It's a massively fun and funny book. There are scenes in here that are genuinely hilarious, and there are more scenes in here that are genuinely devastating. Anyways, Poguemahone is fantastic. It's so much fun to read and listen to. And I think those of you who want to see what happens when you push the form of the novel to a new and innovative space, well, I think you'll like, at the very least, the novelty of this novel. But for now, thanks for watching.